If the plan is to cut emissions quickly, then building hundreds of new data centers that each use as much electricity as a small city feels like we're moving in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and the part that gets me is that the same companies building them keep saying artificial intelligence is going to help us solve the climate crisis.
Right. It's a strange loop when you think about it.
Before we go any further, I want to be clear about what we're actually talking about. For anyone watching from outside the US or Europe, this isn't just a story about technology. It's about a growing gap between what gets presented as necessary progress and how that progress actually lands for most people in their daily lives.
And right now, a big part of that gap is coming from artificial intelligence. Recent analysis shows that if data centers keep growing at the current rate, they could add emissions equivalent to 5 to 10 million extra cars every year by 2030.
At the same time, they're expected to use enough water annually to supply millions of households.
And a lot of these centers are being built in places that already struggle with water.
So, when we talk about decarbonization, the real question for a lot of people is who gets to decide what counts as progress and who ends up dealing with the immediate costs.
This is where the skepticism starts to feel reasonable, even if someone accepts the science. When communities see large new projects pulling significant resources while being told this is all for a better future, it's natural to wonder whether the benefits will actually reach them.
I keep thinking about some of those interviews that came out a couple of years ago. Researchers spoke with people who didn't see climate change as an urgent priority.
A lot of them weren't denying that the planet was warming.
They were questioning whether the proposed solutions matched the scale of disruption being asked of them.
And you see similar patterns elsewhere. With private jets, for example, the response to criticism is often that the emissions will be offset.
But the quality of many offsetting projects is still very much in question.
The pattern that stands out to me is that when solutions seem designed by and for people who won't feel the downsides, trust starts to disappear.
And without trust, even well-designed policies struggle to get real support.
So the core issue isn't whether climate change is real, it's whether the systems being built to respond to it feel legitimate to the people they're supposed to serve. Here's where I want to push back a little though, Jordan. I understand the concern about fairness, but I worry that focusing too heavily on process risks, slowing down action that vulnerable communities actually need.
I'm not arguing for delay.
The difference between limiting warming to 1.5 degrees versus allowing it to reach 2 degrees is already showing up in things like extreme heat and sea level rise.
I'm not arguing for delay. What I'm saying is that when the process feels extractive, when new infrastructure increases pressure on local resources without clear local benefits, people have good reason to be cautious.
That caution isn't the same as denial.
No, it isn't. That caution isn't the same as denial.
But doesn't that risk leaving the communities most exposed to climate impacts waiting the longest for real change?
It can. That's why I think the real question is whether we can design transitions that don't repeat the same patterns of decision-making that created the problem.
Right now, it often feels like a relatively small group of experts and companies sets the direction, and everyone else is expected to adapt.
And you see that as a structural issue rather than just a communication problem?
I do. Because if the power dynamics stay the same, then even good policies are likely to face resistance.
Some of that resistance comes from people who've learned through experience that when powerful interests say something is for the common good, the gains don't always reach the people carrying the heaviest load.
That's fair, and I think the AI example makes this tension especially clear right now.
If the technologies being promoted as part of the solution are themselves driving major increases in energy and water use, then we need to be willing to examine those trade-offs.
Otherwise, it starts to look selective.
People notice when data centers get tax breaks and fast approvals, while ordinary households are told to cut back on their own use.
So the disagreement isn't really about the science. It's about whether the current approach is capable of earning the kind of broad consent it needs.
And at the moment, I'm not convinced it is.
But if we wait until everything feels perfectly fair, don't we risk making the problem worse for the very people we're trying to protect?
That's the difficult part. I'm not saying we need perfect fairness first.
So, what are you saying?
I'm saying that if the process keeps reproducing the same imbalances, then the resistance isn't going to go away. It might even grow.
So, you're arguing that legitimacy is a practical requirement, not just a nice to have.
Yeah, without it, you can have the right policies on paper, but you won't have the public support needed to make them work at the scale required.
That's actually a stronger point than I initially gave it credit for. What keeps coming up for me is this idea of precarity, the sense that a lot of people already live with very little margin for additional pressure.
When new projects increase uncertainty around energy costs or local resources, that existing precarity becomes part of how people evaluate the whole effort.
And by the way, if you've been hearing the phrase just transition used more often recently, this is part of why.
It's meant to describe a shift to a low-carbon economy that protects workers and communities.
But when the actual projects don't feel protective, the phrase starts to lose its meaning.
The harder truth is that rebuilding that sense of legitimacy may take longer than the emissions targets would prefer.
But without it, the targets themselves become difficult to reach in practice.
So we're left with a tension that doesn't have a clean answer.
Either we accept approaches that concentrate both the benefits and the risks in familiar ways, or we accept that building broader support may require slower and more contested processes.
And neither option feels particularly comfortable.
No, but pretending the tension doesn't exist hasn't made the problem any smaller either.
If the tension between rapid technological change and everyday stability feels familiar where you live, we'd be interested in hearing how it's playing out in your community.